Alright, so now we're going to have a look inside of the P-47D's cockpit. This is going to be the D40 version. So starting off from the left. Up the top is the cockpit light. You'll find these on both sides of the cockpit. Under that are the bomb arming handles. You've got the 3 different stations there. And underneath that, that's your air filter control. So you'd use that if you're in dusty conditions, and if you needed to, you can use it to help clear carburetor icing as well. And speaking of carburetor icing, above that is your carburetor heat. So if you feel like you have carb icing, you'll see reduced manifold pressure and whatnot. So you'll pull this control all the way to the aft position. That way you can clear it effectively, which you're not going to be able to do necessarily if you have an intermediate position. Under the railing is going to be your canopy control switch. Then you've got your intercooler control and position. So the intercooler is going to regulate your carburetor air temperature. You'll leave it in the open position most of the time, but sometimes you bring it back to neutral or bring it back to closed if you want to clear carb icing. There's your oil cooler control and the position indicator. And behind the throttle is going to be your gun camera switch, which will let you fire your guns and turn on the camera. Coming down to the left, the yellow handle here is going to control your flaps. These flaps are powered hydraulically, and on the outside here you can see the markings. That's a maximum extension of 40 degrees. Going back inside the cockpit, here's the landing gear control with the red handle. This box here is going to be your trim tab control unit. Got your rudder trim there with the takeoff position, the aileron trim, and the elevator trim, which is tail heavy or nose heavy. Next to the seat is the manual hydraulic pump. You'll use this to give yourself hydraulic pressure if the engine driven pump fails. And if you're going to extend the landing gear, you have to set the flaps to neutral before doing so to avoid sucking away all the pressure. Here's your fuel tank selectors. The left side is going to be your main auxiliary and selecting the external tank. And the other one's going to be your selection of which external tank to use. Coming under the throttle quadrant, this is going to be your main switch panel, which has a lot of the electrical switches for the airplane, along with some circuit breakers. You've got things like the instrument lights, compass light, gun sight brightness, a fuel boost pump control, the external lights, landing lights, cockpit lights, some light test switches, oil dilution switch, the pitot heat, and the generator. Above your main switch box, this is your throttle quadrant. Due to the supercharged control, you've got some extra stuff. So there's your mixture control, the idle cutoff, an auto lean position for cruise, auto rich for normal operation, and full rich if the auto rich was to fail. The one with the P on it, this is your propeller RPM control. And above that's your throttle, and there's a small button on there which will be for your water injection. So this will give you emergency power for about 15 minutes. And behind the throttle is your supercharger control, so generally you'll keep this linked or behind the throttle. For operating the P-47's engine, you can link all 3 of these controls together, so that way when you move the throttle, it'll bring up the propeller and the boost control at the same time. However, most of the time you can get away with just linking the throttle and the boost together up until the point you reach the critical altitude, and this is going to be where the turbo exceeds 20,000 RPM. That's the point at which you're going to unlink the turbo and the throttle, and then you just control your power using the turbo. Now in front of the throttle quadrant, there's a red guarded switch. This is going to be your compressibility flaps. This is what you're going to use if you're in a high-speed dive, then you need to initiate a recovery as safe as possible. Next to that is the propeller switch box. You're going to leave this in the auto position, but if you had a failure and you wanted to run fixed pitch, then you can use that and increase and decrease your RPM accordingly. Now in the D30 and D40, you've got the K14 gun sight. This has a wingspan dial control. This is what you'll set when you're attacking a particular aircraft. On the left, this is your fixed reticule mask. So if it's in the up position, you're going to see the fixed reticule, but if it's down, you're going to hide it. On the left is your range dial. It goes out to a max of 2,400 feet. And this is actually controlled by a twist on the throttle. So you would twist this back and forth to adjust the range. On the instrument panel, you've got your gear warning light. This will light up if the gear is not locked and you've got less than a quarter throttle. There's the clock, directional gyro, airspeed indicator and miles per hour. And under that, you've got your ammeter, battery master switch, magnetos, your altimeter which is measured in feet, turn and slip indicator, and a G-force indicator as well. Now the D40 has an extra control panel here which will let you select the rockets of bombs or the fuel tanks accordingly, and then you can release them using the weapon release switch on the stick. Here's your vertical speed indicator, magnetic compass, manifold pressure with the ranges indicated in colours, the suction gauge, as well as the water pressure indicator, which is going to let you know how much emergency power you have left, low fuel light, and the auxiliary and main tank fuel gauges. These red handles, these are what you'll use in the D30 versions in order to release your bombs and fuel tanks. There's your parking brake, and underneath is your rocket control panel for the D40, which we'll look at when we get into using the weapons of this. There's the attitude indicator, the carburetor air temperature gauge. Normal range is going to be between 0 and 40 degrees. And you got your turbo tachometer with a max RPM of 22,000, so if you were to exceed that, the overspeed light's going to come on. So looking at the rest of the panel is the tachometer. This is going to have your RPM indicated by colours, so cruise is green, operating range is going to be blue, and your max is going to be in red. There's an oil temperature gauge along with oil pressure and fuel pressure gauges. This is your engine primer. This is what you'll be using when you go to start the engine. This is your cowl flaps control. This is going to help control cooling of the engine. This is going to be indicated with the cylinder head temperature, and the normal is going to be between 150 and 200 degrees. And this is your starter switch. So when you hit it to the energize, this is going to start spinning the flywheel, then engage is going to engage the flywheel to the engine for the start. Down here you've got your hydraulic pressure, the oxygen flow blinker, and the oxygen pressure gauge. Over on the right is your recognition lights box. So with this, you basically select the colour you want to display, then you hit the keying switch, and then the keying light will light up when you're actually sending out that light signal. Over on the right wall here is going to be your oxygen regulator. And we have another cockpit light, as well as a cockpit vent control. And here you've got your VHF radio. So you have the different channels, A, B, C and D, as well as a volume knob, and a toggle switch which you can just leave in the remote position. And if you're wondering how to use those 4 different channels, there's the explanation in the box there of how you're going to do that. Underneath is going to be your tailwheel lock, so you have to remember to lock this for takeoff and landing. And here's your Detroller low frequency radio range receiver along with a radio detonator. So that's going to pretty much cover the introduction to the P-47. So the next video is going to be looking at the flows that I've made. Then we're going to go through an engine startup and taxi and takeoff and landing. So until then, remember to fly safe and check your 6.